Welcome to Biology Minds. Today we're going to talk about the lymphatic system. So anytime you're hearing about lymph or lymph nodes or the lymphatic system, we're talking about the immune system, immunity. So they go hand in hand, they're the same thing. So don't get tripped up when some people say the immune system, some people say the lymphatic system. In this textbook, they call it the lymphatic system. Maybe in other textbooks, specifically when we look at lower level textbooks like a living environment or a biology textbook, ninth grade biology textbook, they're going to call it the immune system. But really, it's the lymphatic system. When we're talking about anatomy and physiology, we're going to call it the lymphatic system. But they go hand in hand, the same thing. So it's all about pathogens. Now, our body, we've talked about numerous systems and the different functions that they have. But when we talk about making sure that our body is safe from invaders, we're talking about making sure that we're not having any issues with pathogens. So the lymphatic system is all about making sure that pathogens don't take over. We've talked about the normal body flora, about our microbiome. So we know that we constantly have this bacteria, we constantly have these viruses, and we have fungi, all always on our crawling our skin and our body. All right, but the difference is that we're going to have the good ones, the good bacteria that we want there, and they're going to help to keep the bad stuff at bay. So as much as they're going to keep that bad stuff at bay, we also are looking for that lymphatic system to keep an eye on things and make sure that we're getting rid of any invaders that we don't want there or that could potentially take over and cause major issues. So whenever we're talking about pathogens, we're talking about viruses, bacteria, fungi, and parasites. Each of them is going to attack us in a specific way, and we need a particular way to fight them off. So the lymphatic system, it protects us against disease. It protects us against those pathogens, and the cells are going to respond to environmental pathogens, toxins, and any abnormal body cells such as cancer cells, mutated cells, cells that are a little off that could cause some issues. So we have lymphocytes, which are a part of our immune response, our body's response to invaders. They're going to identify, attack, and develop immunity to specific pathogens. The immune system, when we talk about immunity, it's the ability to resist that infection and that disease, which is what the lymphatic system does. So it's the same system, just two different names. All body cells and tissues involved in the production of immunity. It's not just the lymphatic system. So when we talk about the skin being a primary barrier, well, maybe that's not part of the lymphatic system per se, but it is a part of the immunity. But you're going to hear these words used interchangeably. We have nonspecific defenses that are going to block or attack any potential infectious organisms. Cannot distinguish one attack from another. All right, not specific. It's not going after one particular thing. All right. You have different levels of organization. We talk about the lymphatic system. You have lymph, which is going to be the fluid, which is mostly water, similar to plasma, but it doesn't have those plasma proteins. You have lymphatic vessels, which the lymph is going to travel through, lymphoid tissue and lymphoid organs, and then you're going to have our cells down to the cellular level, our lymphocytes, our phagocytes, and other immune system cells. So when we look at the lymphatic system, we're talking about the lymph vessels and the lymph nodes. So people think about fluid being circulated through your body as being the circulatory system. Well, that's true. Yes, it's being circulated through the blood, but we also have this lymphatic system which is circulating fluid, our lymph fluid throughout these ducts or these vessels that are going to filter out the fluid and make sure that any invaders are going to make their way out. So some major ducts that we talk about are the cervical or the neck ducts, the thoracic and the chest, the right lymphatic duct. You have the armpit or the axillary lymph nodes, and you have lymphatics of the mammary glands. You have the cisterna chyli, which is going to be this major vessel right here. Lymphatics of the upper limb, lumbar lymphatic nodes, and then you have some major organs where we talk about different tonsils that we have. We have the thymus that is going to help to make T cells, which we're going to talk about in a moment. We have the spleen, and then you have this MALT, or the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue as well. Then we get lower, we see that the appendix is part of the lymphatic system. You have red bone marrow, which is going to be important with our B cells. When we're talking about T cells, B cells, these are our white blood cells. So we talked about this previously when we talked about blood, but this is where we see exactly what does do the white blood cells do and how do they help with immunity. You have lymph nodes throughout your groin, which is your inguinal region, and then you also have the ducts and some lymph nodes within your lower limbs. We're going to see that the lymphatic system is going to produce, maintain, and distribute these lymphocytes to help ward off, help fight those pathogens. Lymphocytes are produced in lymphoid tissues like the tonsils, lymphoid organs like the spleen, the thymus, and in red bone marrow. So lymphocyte distribution detects problems, and it travels into the site of injury or infection. So it's going to go where the infection is and help to get rid of those pathogens that aren't supposed to be there. Lymphocyte circulation from the blood to the interstitial fluid through capillaries returns to the venous blood through the lymphatic vessels. So it makes its way back into that circulatory system, and the circulation of fluids from the blood plasma to the lymph and back to the venous system. We're going to see that it's transporting that lymph back and forth constantly, trying to filter out any pathogens, transports hormones, nutrients, and waste products. Lymphatic vessels are vessels that carry lymph. Lymphatic system begins with the small vessels, the smallest vessels, and those are the lymphatic capillaries or terminal lymphatics. When we look at this exchange, we see that we have this interstitial fluid that is going into our lymphatic vessels. All right, from this is showing us from the areolar tissue, and we have our capillaries here. We see, we have an arteriole as it's going through, and we're seeing in the capillaries that exchange is taking place. There's also an exchange of not only oxygen and carbon dioxide, but also of the fluid. And then it's going to make its way back to, some of that blood is going to make its way back to the venules, and the interstitial fluid is going to make its way to the lymph vessels so that they can then go to the lymph nodes and start filtering out any pathogens. The endothelial cells loosely are bound together with overlap, just like we talked about when we talked about the blood capillaries. Or the circulatory system capillaries, where it's just that thin wall of epithelial cells so that diffusion can occur. The same thing goes for the lymphatic capillaries. Overlap acts as a one-way valve which allows fluids, solutes, viruses, bacteria to enter, and it prevents the return to intercellular space. Lymph flows from the lymphatic capillaries to the larger lymphatic vessels, which contain that one-way valve, so there's no backflow, and the lymphatic vessels travel with veins. So where we see that in the circulatory system, we have that heart that is constantly pumping, and there's a lot of pressure in those arteries. The lymphatic system doesn't have that pressure, so it's a lot more like the veins, where it needs those valves so that there's no backflow. Lacteals are these special lymphatic capillaries in the small intestine, and they transport lipids from the digestive tract. Major lymph collecting vessels, the base of the thoracic duct, the duct in the chest, which expands into that cisterna chyli, and that cisterna chyli is gonna receive lymph from the right and the left lumbar trunks and the intestinal trunk as well. The inferior segment of the thoracic duct is going to collect lymph from the left bronchomediastinal trunk, the left subclavian trunk, and the left jugular trunk, and it empties into the left subclavian vein. So we see that it's coming in through the capillaries, through that interstitial fluid, and it's leaving to enter back into the circulatory system through the major veins. And the right lymphatic duct is then going to empty into the right subclavian vein after it collects the lymph from the right jugular trunk, the right subclavian trunk, and the right bronchomediastinal trunk. So this just shows you the diagram of how we have these lymphatic ducts, and they're going to filter back into these major veins. Any drainage of the right lymphatic duct is dealing with this, and then the thoracic duct is dealing with the rest of this. So lymphedema, or sometimes they just call it edema, it's going to be a blockage of lymph drainage from a limb, and it's going to cause severe swelling. So typically in older people and people that are very sick, they're going to have these blockages, and it's going to lead to lymphedema, where there's a buildup of that interstitial fluid, and we see a swelling in that tissue area, and it interferes with the immune system function because it's not able to move those fluids into the lymph and filter out the pathogen. So with that flow being cut back, it's not able to do what it's supposed to do. So lymphedema it indicates disease, it indicates problems, and it also is going to lead to more problems because that your lymphatic system is not going to be able to work the way it should. When we talk about the lymphatic system, we're talking about mainly lymphocytes, those white blood cells that play a major role in making sure that we're healthy and make up 20 to 40% of the circulating leukocytes, which we talked about when we talked about blood, and most are stored they're not actually circulating. So different types of lymphocytes, we talked about the T cells made in the thymus, the B cells made in the bone marrow, and then there's actually natural killer cells. We have T cells. There's different types of T cells. You have cytotoxic T cells, which are often called killer T cells. And you have memory T cells, helper T cells, and suppressor T cells, which all play a role in maintaining homeostasis and making sure that pathogens aren't taking over. The cytotoxic T cells or the killer T cells are going to attack cells infected by viruses, and they produce cell-mediated immunity. Memory T cells are going to be formed in response to a foreign substance, and they're going to remain in the body to give immunity, so that these are learning how to fight something for the next time. So the first time you get very sick when you're exposed to that pathogen, the second time you have these memory T cells that are going to immediately pick up on it, and they know how to fight that pathogen. So you don't get as sick the second time. Your body's able to immediately respond to it and know how to fight it. Helper T cells, they are there to stimulate the T cells and the B cells. So we need helper T cells in order for us to remain healthy. You have suppressor T cells, which are going to inhibit the function of T cells and B cells, and then you have regulatory T cells, which are helper or suppressor T cells, and they control the sensitivity of the immune system. Other T cells that we don't really get into too much are inflammatory T cells, and then suppressor or inducer T cells. Apart from that, we have our B cells, which make up about 10 to 15% of the lymphocytes that we see that are circulating, and they differentiate into plasma cells, and the plasma cells are going to produce and secrete antibodies. So when we talk about B cells, we're talking about how now we are flagging these antigens or these pathogens, and we are attacking them by flagging them. Sometimes you'll hear antibodies referred to as immunoglobulins. They are the same thing, so don't get tripped up by that. Antigens are the targets that identify any pathogen or foreign compound. So when we talk about a pathogen, all right, pathogen might be a circle like this, and then maybe it has something on its cell membrane that makes it distinguishable, and we're going to send out these antibodies that are going to latch on to those targets and flag it and say, hey, we need to get rid of this. So immunoglobulins are going to be the antibodies, and they're the binding of a specific antibody to its specific target antigen, and it initiates right? It's mediated by the antibodies. The antibodies are controlling this antibody-mediated immunity. Antibody-mediated immunity, it's a chain of events that destroys the target compound or organism. We have natural killer cells, which are going to be separate from our T cells and our B cells, and they're also called large granular lymphocytes. Make up 5 to 10% of the circulating lymphocytes and are responsible for surveillance. They attack foreign cells, virus-infected cells, and cancer cells. So those natural killer cells, they're not going after the pathogens. They're going after the cells that have already been infected with the pathogen. So they're going for those problematic cells, and they're going to get rid of them, which is okay because we know we make more cells constantly. But we need those natural killer cells to get rid of the bad cells that have been infected and keep the good cells that we want to keep there. So when we divide the lymphocytes into different classes, we have our T cells, where we talk about our cytotoxic T cells, our killer T cells, our helper T cells, our suppressor T cells, and our memory T cells. The big one is the helper T cells because they are going to stimulate the activation and the function of those T cells and those B cells. The B cells are going to create plasma cells. When stimulated, those B cells can differentiate into the plasma cells, which produce and secrete those antibodies, which are going to flag our antigens on our pathogen. And then we have natural killer cells, which are going to make up the remaining, and they're going to attack those cells that are infected. Lymphocyte distribution, tissues maintain different T cell and B cell populations depending on a number of things, and lymphocytes wander through tissues. They're going to enter through the blood vessels or lymphatics for transport, and they can survive for many years. Lymphocyte production, also called lymphopoiesis, involves the bone marrow, which is going to make those B cells. The thymus is going to make those T cells, as well as the peripheral lymphoid tissues. Hemocytoblasts in the bone marrow, they divide into two types of lymphoid stem cells, which are going to make our different white blood cells. So here we see the diagram where we have a stem cell, and that can either become a lymphoid stem cell, interleukin 7, which then is going to become a natural killer cell or a B cell, or it could just become a lymphoid stem cell and then become a mature T cell. And we see that T cells and B cells are going to migrate throughout the body, regardless of their distribution, in order to defend the peripheral tissues, and retaining their ability to divide is essential to the immune system function. So differentiation, where we see that they become B cells or T cells, and then the specific types of B cells and T cells, with exposure to a hormone called cytokine or interleukin 7, that's going to cause differentiation in the B cells. And when we talk about the differentiation in T cells, it's going to be exposure to several different thymic hormones. So this is done by cytokine in our B cells and hormones in our T cells. Some lymphoid organs, we talk about the lymph nodes. They're all over the body. You have the thymus that sits above the heart, and then you have the spleen in the abdomen. They're separated from surrounding tissues by a fibrous connective tissue capsule. This is a lymph node where we're going to see that we have these afferent vessels. So lymph is coming in through all these vessels. It is filtering the lymph for any pathogens, any invaders, okay, and then it's making its way out through the efferent vessel. So lymph flows through the lymph node in a network of sinuses or open areas from subcapsular space through the outer cortex, through the deep cortex, through the core medulla, and we see that then it's going to make its way through the efferent vessel. So has several layers where it is going to filter out that blood. Lymph node function, it's a filter. It removes debris, pathogens, and 99% of the antigens. Antigen presentation, first step in the immune response, we need to see those antigens. We need to tag them with the antibodies, and we need to attack them. So it's extracted antigens are presented to the lymphocytes or attached to the dendritic cells to stimulate lymphocytes. Lymphatic functions, lymphoid tissue and lymph nodes, they're going to be distributed to monitor peripheral infections, respond before infections reach vital organs or trunks, and the lymph nodes of the gut, the trachea, the lungs, and the thoracic ducts, they're going to protect against pathogens in the digestive and the respiratory systems. Lymph nodes are ultimately glands that are large. We have large lymph nodes in the groin, the back of the neck, and they're going to swell in response to any inflammation. So when you go to the doctor, sometimes they'll say, oh yeah, your nodes in your neck are swollen. You can actually feel little bumps. When you get sick, these little nodes get a lot bigger, and they can feel them. And they say, well, yeah, this is an immune response to some kind of infection that you have. Lymphadenopathy is going to be a chronic or excessive enlargement of the lymph nodes. So that's just the anatomical term for you have swollen lymph nodes. But it's going to typically indicate infections, but it can also indicate that there's an issue with your endocrine system or that you have cancer. Function of the spleen. It's going to remove abnormal blood cells and other blood components by phagocytosis. Storage of iron recycled from the red blood cells. It's going to initiation of the immune response by the B cells and the T cells. Lymphatic system and the body defenses. We see that there's two categories of defenses. You have non-specific and you have specific, or called innate or adaptive. So when we talk about non-specific, it's, things are going around. It's just taking care of anything that shouldn't be there. Specific is it's going for particular pathogens and breaking them down and getting rid of them. So when we talk about non-specific or innate immunity, always works the same way against any type of invader or pathogen. We call it non-specific resistance. And then you have adaptive or specific immunity, which protects against specific pathogens. The specific virus, the specific bacteria depends on the activities of the lymphocytes. Develops after exposure to environmental hazards. So 7 major categories of non-specific immunity. We talk about physical barriers, which obviously the big one is skin. And then you have phagocytes, which are going to attack anything that's not supposed to be there. It's not going to attack a specific type of bacteria. You have immune surveillance, interferons, complement, inflammatory response, and as well as fever. When we talk about so this is a great diagram to show you the different innate defenses. And then when we talk about specific defenses or adaptive defenses, you have the specific resistance or your immunity, which responds to the specific antigens that we are going to flag. So with coordinated action of the T cells and the B cells, or T cells are going to be the cell-mediated immunity, which defends against abnormal cells and pathogens inside cells, where the B cells, it's going to be the antibody-mediated immunity, which defends against antigen and pathogens in the body fluids. So you have different forms of immunity. We talk about innate, which is present at birth, adaptive, which is after birth, active, which are your antibodies developed after exposure to the pathogens or the antigen, and then passive, which is your antibodies are transferred from another source. Active immunity is going to be naturally acquired through the environment, exposure to the pathogens, or artificially induced, which is through vaccines. Right now, we hear a lot about vaccines because people think that there's poison in them, that it's hurting people. Anything that's ever happened to anyone because of a vaccine, any adverse effects, the rates are a lot lower than the issues that people can run into if they don't get vaccinated. So in the big scope, there might be major, very minor issues with people having adverse effects or bad effects from taking vaccines, but in the big scope of things, more lives have been saved than hurt from vaccines. So vaccines are important. We see on Facebook, on the internet, there's tons of people constantly posting about how bad vaccines are, but it's just not true. They have no real scientific evidence. It's this community that, now we hear about people thinking that the earth is flat and all these different things, but there's nothing to really back it up. And that same goes for vaccines. So vaccines are important. You should get your child vaccinated. Any issue, any adverse effects that there have been, we see that they're working towards getting rid of that. There was an issue with mercury being in some of the vaccines, and they've now done away with the mercury in most of the vaccines, I believe, if not all of them. So they're working to make it better, and ultimately you don't want your child to die from something that could have been prevented by having a vaccine when they were a baby. So vaccines are important. You have to get vaccines. It's silly to believe the hype and read on Facebook that vaccines are bad, because it's just not true. That they have no science to back it up, and we have all the science to say, hey, vaccines are good. We need to keep getting vaccines because it's better to have this artificially induced active immunity when you don't want to get it if you think there's going to be an issue by getting it naturally. Okay, so if you wait to get it naturally, your body might not be able to overcome it, because with vaccines, it's actually a dead or weakened version of the pathogen, so our body's able to fight it a little bit better. Initially, we get the exposure to it, but we're able to fight it. Where if it's naturally acquired, you could run into some major issues. So if there's a vaccine for something, it's important to use it. Then you have passive immunity, which is naturally acquired, antibodies acquired from your mother, which is why they say breastfeeding is so important, because you get those antibodies from your mother through the breast milk, artificially induced by an injection of antibodies. It's a great diagram showing you the differences between your innate and your adaptive immunity, and then your active versus your passive immunity. So four major types of cells. We have cytotoxic T cells, also called TC cells, sometimes called killer T cells. They're going to attack cells infected by viruses, responsible for cell-mediated immunity. Then you have your memory T cells. They're going to clone more of themselves in response to a specific antigen that they are going to remember. So it creates a memory so that next time we run into it, we know, hey, I know how to fight it. I know how to get rid of it. If it's here, it shouldn't be here. Helper T cells, also called TH cells, they're going to stimulate the T cells and the B cells, so they're extremely important. And then you have suppressor T cells, which are going to inhibit the function of T cells and B cells. B cells are responsible for antibody-mediated immunity, attack the antigens by producing specific antibodies. Millions of populations, each with different antibody molecules. So you have B cell sensitization, which is corresponding antigens in interstitial fluids bind to the B cell receptors, and the B cell prepares for activation, and then the preparation process is sensitization. During sensitization, antigens are taken into the B cells, processed, reappear on the surface, bound to this class 2 MHC protein. So it's presenting it, saying, hey, let's learn about this. And the helper T cells are going to be sensitized, B cell is prepared for activation, but needs helper T cell activation by this same antigen. And then the B cell activation, we're going to see that the helper T cell binds to the MHC complex and secretes cytokines that promote B cell activation and division. You have plasma cells, which are going to synthesize and secrete antibodies into interstitial fluid, and memory B cells, like memory T cells, remain in reserve to respond to the next infection. You have 5 heavy chain constant segments determined by 5 types of antibodies. So when we talk about antibodies, they all have this 5 heavy chain segments to it. Has the same kind of structure, but we have 5 different types. You have the IgG, IgE, IgD, IgM, and IgA. 5 classes of antibodies or immunoglobulins. They're found in the body fluids. They're determined by constant segments and have no effect on antibody specificity. You have IgG as the largest and most diverse class of antibodies. It's responsible for resistance against many viruses, bacteria, and bacterial toxins. Can cross the placenta, and maternal IgG provides passive immunity to the fetus during embryological development. IgE attaches as an individual molecule to the exposed surfaces of basophils and mast cells, and when an antigen is bound to IgE molecules, the cell is stimulated to release histamine and other chemicals that accelerate inflammation in the immediate area. So it's like an allergic response. IgD is an individual molecule on the surfaces of B cells where it can bind antigens in the extracellular fluid, and the binding can play a role in the sensitization of the B cells that are involved. IgM is the first class of antibodies secreted after an antigen is encountered, and the IgM concentration declines as IgG production accelerates. So IgM declines as we see IgG is making its way to increased numbers. And IgA is found primarily in glandular secretions such as mucus, tears, saliva, and semen, and attacks the pathogens before they gain access to internal tissues. This just is a diagram showing you the different how we have, they all look very similar, but you have these different kind of shapes to them, just molecularly you can see how they are, these look a lot more different, but they have the same general idea to it. So keep these things in mind as we move forward, how the immune system and the more specifically the lymphatic system is maintaining our homeostasis by making sure that pathogens, antigens are not invading and taking over our body.